Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring what we know and what we don't know about consciousness. My guest is Robert Davis, a retired professor of neuroscience from the State University of New York. He is author of several books, including The UFO Phenomenon, Should I Believe? Life After Death, An Analysis of the Evidence. Unseen Forces, The Integration of Science, Reality, and You. His newest book, based on his recently produced documentary, is called The Consciousness Connection, Extraordinary Human Experience and the Nature of Reality. Bob lives in Florida, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Bob. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you, Jeff.
Before we get into the interview, I want to acknowledge you for writing the introduction to the third book in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series on UFOs and UAP. Are we really alone? And I know that, in a way, is where your own story started, as I recall, about 10 years ago when you had a dramatic example of witnessing a UFO.
Yes, my wife and I, we saw two orange orbs in the night sky in Sedona, Arizona, and that started the ball rolling. I wrote a book, The UFO Phenomenon, Should I Believe, as a result of those sightings. They could be orbs. They weren't structured craft, but they didn't appear to belong where they were when we first saw them.
So prior to your UFO experience, would it be fair to say that you thought of yourself as a conventional, basically materialist neuroscientist?
I wasn't a strict materialist because I've always been a closet ufologist. That topic has always stimulated great interest in me. I wouldn't mention it to my colleagues at the college, of course, although I have and paid consequences for it. But so I wasn't a strict materialist, had an open mind to many possibilities. Listening to your show back in the late 80s, New Thinking Aloud, also stimulated my interest in ESP and parapsychology, which helped me evolve in that manner too. But it wasn't until I retired and had 3 unique experiences that my whole concept of reality changed dramatically, resulting from each of the 3 extraordinary human experiences that I had.
Well, we've covered quite a bit of your experiences in previous interviews. I know you've described very dramatically a Kundalini experience that you had, and then there's the UFO encounter. But I guess it would be fair to say that in your profession as a neuroscientist at the State University of New York, as far as your colleagues were concerned, you were just another one of the materialist scientists on the faculty.
I was another egoic so-called scholar on the road to publish and perish. and I was one of the crew, but I was alone in that respect, and didn't find much comfort in my discussions with people on the matter. I couldn't find people to talk to about this again until I retired, and then had my experiences. And only recently, Jeff, have I talked about my Kundalini awakening. I really haven't delved deeply into that on various podcasts that I've done because of the stigma associated with Kundalini awakenings. I'm not just talking about a spiritual awakening. I'm talking about an energetic, full-blown Kundalini awakening, which is quite distinct, more than gets your attention. And because of the stigma associated with spiritual awakenings in general, I didn't discuss it, Jeff. And you know, I'm willing to certainly now, because we have the opportunity to convince people who have some degree of doubt about the validity of a Kundalini awakening, and I encourage people to read about it. It is valid. It is real, just like ESP is and parapsychology is. Kundalini awakenings certainly are. And I was only aware of that because I had it. And I could say with 100% certainty that the mind and body are distinctly different. You get a dual sense of your body behaving distinctly different than your mind, and that you can't control your body. When I had my Kundalini brought on by the facilitation of intention from another guru or master, I found my body behaving in a manner that looked much like Reagan did in the movie The Exorcist. I kid you not, without the green soup. But while that was occurring, while my body was gyrating in violent ways, I felt bliss. It was a complete dichotomy of my appearance to an outsider, if they were viewing me, because I looked like I was being tortured. Yet I was doing this all the time. Give me more, to the person who was inducing it in me. I loved it. You feel that bliss. You feel that the loss of boundaries. You sense almost like an egoic death in a way. And you come to realize many things thereafter. And it takes a good long period of time afterwards to try to make sense out of it. And it was certainly anxiety provoking, indeed, not knowing what it was, why it happened, how it happened, and how I can get rid of some of the symptoms that I was experiencing, like anxiety, which is a normal consequence of a Kundalini awakening.
So we can say, I suppose, in terms of what we know about consciousness, Kundalini is real. And as far as I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we have no way of providing a conventional description of a Kundalini experience from the point of view of conventional physiology and neuroscience.
Not at all. Not at all. We know that Kundalini experience encompasses these spiritual experiences of non-dual meditation. It's a common feature. Yet, when we study the brain, we can't come up with an answer in terms of why this person is behaving the way they are when they're having a Kundalini awakening. The problem is that our paltry, materialistic, fictitious science of Newtonian physics, which we sorely need, which has provided us with a great deal of benefits, however, can't explain neuroscientifically and otherwise what is actually going on in the brain during a Kundalini awakening. We're talking about a spiritual consciousness. We're talking about terms that are used like bliss, energetic, ineffable. We're talking about a state of consciousness that can't be described to somebody who doesn't experience it. And that's true for many of the topics that we cover. The semantics, the language that we use doesn't accurately capture essentially what is going on, let alone studying it. The problem is consciousness is reduced to neurophysiology in neuroscience. And a Kundalini awakening is not regarded as a normal process. So it's often excluded from any serious study by scientists. I'm not aware of any serious study explaining the Kundalini awakening other than studies that have been done on individuals who had them and describe their experiences and the outcomes that it generally provides. But it's generally phenomenology at this point, just characterizing the symptoms, let alone explaining brain-wise what is really going on with the Kundalini awakening.
On the other hand, if we look at the Eastern traditions, there are very detailed descriptions involving all sorts of channels through the body through which energy passes, channels that are not recognized by Western science, perhaps associated with acupuncture, perhaps associated with yoga, and a complete anatomy of a spiritual body involving chakras or organs of spiritual perception, and the idea that the goddess Shakti exists within our body and is moving around through these channels, activating the different organs of spiritual perception. So it would seem as if some of the spiritual masters in the East have a very refined understanding of these sorts of things.
Well, the awakening of Kundalini is, as you allude to, is believed to activate the crown chakra that's associated with spiritual consciousness. And people get that sense of transcendence, the interconnectedness, unique insights into the nature of reality and the meaning, purpose of life. And this process has been reported to lead to deeper self-understanding and expanded consciousness by those who have it. And yet, through the guru's guidance and specific yoga practices, like in Eastern meditation, mantra repetition, breathing postures, chanting, there's various ways an awakening, a Kundalini awakening can occur. But it's triggered often by intense emotional stimuli, even shock, childbirth, psychedelics, even physical abuse has been known to facilitate it. But yeah, the experience is said to be complete when Kundalini energy stabilizes in the crown center of universal consciousness, in the crown chakra. Now this goes against obviously Western science. And while we are advanced technologically in the West, we pale in comparison to our understanding of spiritual types of experiences like the Kundalini, which Eastern philosophy, Eastern countries are much more attuned to and have affinity towards. They understand this more so. And that's why it doesn't get the type of attention scientifically that it certainly deserves. And that's true not only for Kundalini, but all aspects of parapsychological phenomena.
In your case, you were working with an individual who was intentionally triggering this experience for you.
She was talking about removing engrams, cleaning organs, removing attachments to specific organs of the body. She was, by the way, a former physician. And while she was just speaking, it wasn't the words, it was intentionality of some type that was being delivered to me. And I can't explain it, Jeff, but I have spoken to other people who've had a Kundalini, like Marjorie Wollicott, who I know you know. And she had a full-blown Kundalini awakening by being touched on the forehead by a shaman or guru. I had it facilitated through intention, which I believe was behind the words that this physician was expressing to me that facilitated the Kundalini. But it changed the direction of my life. And most people who have Kundalini awakenings, about 50% of them are known to change their profession into areas that are more aligned with the serving of humanity, with the ecology, becoming more attuned to the greater importance of life, becoming less selfish, less egoic, and less centered. I'm not the center of the universe anymore, so to speak, relative to where they were beforehand. But it does take a long time to integrate. In fact, there was a recent study, I think Cornel and Luke did. 140 or so individuals had a Kundalini. 90% felt it was a very positive experience in the short term. 98% considered it a very positive experience in the long term. Now, that doesn't mean, like near-death experiences, they're all wonderful experiences. Not at all. 20% of near-death experiences are distressing. Likewise, with Kundalini, there is a certain percentage that certainly is distressing, especially when one is not guided appropriately or not forewarned that a Kundalini awakening might happen. And that is critical, the proper coaching. I encourage people to seek having a Kundalini awakening, but they have to be very careful and diligent about it, making sure that they are adequately coached by those who understand the phenomena so that they can put it in perspective and manage it as best as possible. For me, I had my full-blown Kundalini awakening, and you're full of energy, anxiety, and then some. And 2 days later, I had to travel to America, and that's the last thing you want to do. But I became a tree hugger in the process. Don't ask me why, but right after that, every time I'd hike in the woods, I'd feel integrated with my environment. I started to hug trees. I didn't take them for granted. Now, even people that don't believe in God, there was a study done, 30% of people believed in God before their Kundalini. It rose to something like 70 to 80% then believed in a deity following their Kundalini. Like a near-death experience, there are similarities among all of these extraordinary human experiences where we have maybe the common denominator is this loss of ego functioning that Walter Stace and what's his name, the father of psychology,
William James.
Yeah, they talked about Kundalini awakenings a century ago, many decades ago, and they acknowledged its existence, and they were right. So it should not be discounted as imaginal or anything else. It is valid.
Well, I think what I hear you saying is, on the one hand, it's real and therefore ought to be something that scientists study and consider, because certainly scientists study reality. On the other hand, it invokes ideas that transcend science completely, like God. God is not considered a scientific concept as far as I know. Maybe that needs to change before science can really come to terms with phenomena like Kundalini.
Good point. In order for that to happen, we need a paradigm shift. And the objective of my film that's on Gaia.com now, the Consciousness Connection Foundation, and the basis of my book, The Consciousness Connection, the same name as the movie, it was done to promote a paradigm shift, which is what we need to get at your question. We need to somehow convince academia that parapsychological science should be considered a serious mode of investigative analysis that requires considerable research, funding, and support from in every possible way, so that individuals like yourself can have doctorates in parapsychology. You shouldn't be the only one with a PhD in parapsychology. It is a real science, and unfortunately, in the West, where consciousness is regarded as something nebulous and a matter of more than speculation, we need to consider it as a real science, because the objective of the film, the book, is to bridge that divide between the materialist perspectives and the subjective nature of human experiences. And we have to recognize these types of paranormal, parapsychological examples like Kundalini, near-death, out-of-body, mediumship. There's many different types that come in a wide spectrum of events, but it should be considered an essential research discipline within an evolving scientific paradigm that, again, merits much more serious attention from mainstream science that it gets.
Well, let's go back to your UFO experience for a moment. I'd like to kind of see if we can find a connection between the Kundalini experience and the UFO experience, particularly in the light of the fact that I would say a significant portion of the ufology community, maybe let's say 50%, are still viewing it in terms of materialist science, that UFOs are nuts and bolts spacecraft that travel somehow from distant locations and arrive on this planet.
I bow to people like J. Allen Hynek, John Mack, Jacques Vallée. These are scholars in the area, far more attuned to the topic matter than I. UAPs are valid. There's no question about it. J. Allen Hynek, back in '68, when he spoke to a subcommittee looking at the UFO phenomenon, he said at that time, it is a phenomenon that is beyond our terrestrial mode of analysis and thought, and that it's a mental as well as a physical, quote unquote, a mental and physical phenomenon. He acknowledged it back then, a spiritual component. We all know Jacques Vallée, who considers UAP as well to be a control system, as he says. But he contends, however, that UAPs are likely from Earth. He estimates that there have been millions of UFO landings over the past decade, thinking, therefore, that it must not be extraterrestrial, but it must be terrestrial. These UFOs, non-human intelligences associated with them, he considers them to be native to the planet. As if we find 150 new species every day, that's just another species that are interacting with us. But if that is true, they are certainly interacting with us physically as well as mentally, as people contest. John Mack, obviously, the Harvard psychiatrist who did research on interactions with non-human intelligences, was profoundly convinced that UAPs are real and that people are having these types of interactions after making careful study of them, psychopathology-wise, saying that they are normal, sane, they have no secondary gain. The similarity of the reports are remarkable. And he was convinced. So I bow to them in terms of an answer. I did, however, work with the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Research Foundation We talked about it on one of your shows.
Yeah.
The FREE survey, Dr. Edgar Mitchell Research Foundation for Extraterrestrial Experiences. And we studied over 3,200 individuals who interacted with the phenomenon, who are more than convinced that it's a diverse physical as well as a psychological experience. 80% of them felt it to be very favorable, and did not want their interactions to end, which is very interesting. The more interactions they had, so they report, the more they wanted it to continue, as if they're adapting to the experience, getting accustomed to it and benefiting from it. In fact, a recent study done on the Phoenix Lights, a colleague of mine who also co-authored a paper, who was working with me on FREE, just did a study on the Phoenix Lights, studying 115 people who observed the Phoenix Lights back in, I forget when it was, 98, 97, probably the largest mass sighting of UFOs, covered 4 states. We're talking about a mile-wide UAP floating over Sky Harbor in Phoenix, Arizona, before taking off over 4 states, where millions of people have seen it. But the point is, of these 115 people, there were remarkable similarities between the results from the FREE study as well as MUFON's experiences study led by Kathleen Martin. Meaning, probably the most important thing is not only the clear, convincing experience that these people report when they have it, but they receive spiritual messages. About 40-50% say they receive spiritual messages as well as technological information, as well as guidance about their life. So the similarity in reports of these kinds of psychological states, of the types of telepathic communications, and more importantly, the thematic content of those messages is what gets my attention. Why the similarity? Why the spiritual nature of the phenomenon? It reminds me of David Bohm, the noted physicist, of the implicate and explicit order, where the implicit, the locality and causality is complemented by the implicit. David Bohm put it this way: we have quantum processes occurring in the brain, and we are capable, he thinks, of communicating with extraterrestrials, as if we're receiving downloads from other intelligences in other aspects or places in the galaxy that are commanding us, that are controlling us. So we have a unique disparity between the external and the internal. It reminds me of Carl Jung, who regarded UAP reports and experiences as archetypes. These are inherited images that are shared by humanity. And he was a believer, but he felt that that this phenomenon somehow represented an unconscious state of mind, not necessarily disparaging the phenomenon, but noting that it is real, however, in the minds of people. Now, and he did write a book on UAP where he did say he believed in the phenomenon, but he also describes it in his unique psychological ways.
As I recall, Jung implied that the UFO reports could represent the birth of a new religion.
And many people regard it as a religion, which is why you have to be very careful when you speak to people who are interested in the topic. I know people who question people's belief in the UFOs, and the people's reaction is, I want nothing to do with that person anymore. It's almost as if their religion is being attacked. And it is taking the place, in a sense, of religion. People need to believe in something. That seems to be a basic tenet of human behavior. And with the decline in organized religion and an increase in spirituality, affinity towards consciousness-related matters, we see that the UAP is valid, and it transforms people in similar ways to the near-death experience and the Kundalini awakening. Getting back more specifically to your question, it is as if these are inspiring events, and they come in diverse ways. For some reason, neuroscience can't explain it, but psychologists try to get at it when they talk about ego loss, ego dissolution. And that can be facilitated by these extraordinary human experiences, no matter what they are. It's almost as if people are being put in their place. John Mack believed that it was the intent of these beings to do just that, raise the spiritual level of people. That was the major goal in his mind. After he did his research, and a lot of people do believe that, because people do become more spiritual, more consciousness. Let's just say that they become more truth seekers. They become truth seekers, more spiritual in nature. No longer are interested in organized religion, and much more so interested in spiritual matters.
So it would seem, if whether we're talking about a UFO abduction or UFO contact, a Kundalini experience, or a near-death experience, to which you alluded and we'll get into in more depth, in all of these cases, we're dealing with an experience which is potentially and often actually traumatic for people, sometimes involving serious physical harm, certainly involving quite a bit of anxiety, social difficulties, a need to spend a long time integrating. But at the end of the day, people are grateful for these experiences. And as you pointed out, people want more.
Believe it or not, most people want more. There is a look, as far as near-death experiences go, 200,000 people in the United States alone have a near-death experience. It translates to millions, of course, over time, just in our country. And 20% of them are distressing. Now, they don't want it again. Same is true with the UAP. These three studies that I referred to earlier, about 20 to 30% of the population regards it as a highly negative experience. So it's not always positive, although the vast majority of individuals who have these kinds of experiences do say they benefit over time in psycho-spiritual, psychosocial ways. But it is not a slam dunk guarantee that it's going to have a positive impact on people.
Especially when you consider that in modern Western societies, we don't give people much social support for those experiences. People are afraid to talk about it because they're afraid that their friends, their relatives, and in particular their employers will consider them a little crazy.
Yes, and that stigma, I think, is being reduced somewhat, especially with the disclosure movement, which began in 2017. The stigma certainly still exists, as it does in all aspects of parapsychological sciences, but I think it's being reduced somewhat. And the internet, social media, is helping that. Certainly you are at the forefront too, Jeff, in what you do by bringing these matters of attention that are of extreme importance and should be given much more consideration, certainly by science, which I've said a few times already. And it doesn't matter necessarily what the experience is. They seem to give rise to maybe consciousness being the foundation, the framework upon which is modified, regardless of the experience itself, which can be vastly different from one another. A near-death experience certainly is vastly different from a UAP interaction and a Kundalini and mediumship and ESP. But yet they do share that common thread. Consciousness is altered, and people as a result are different. They are changed, largely, in the majority, for the better.
Well, I know that Ray Hernandez, whom you worked with initially on the Edgar Mitchell Foundation project, believes that all of these phenomena are linked. And in fact, he has written a book called, I think, Consciousness in the Mind of God. He says they all come out of the mind of God. That's the connection. And that we're all connected, one might even say at the quantum level, through quantum entanglement with everything in the universe. Everything is interconnected with everything. And ultimately, consciousness itself is that connection that we have with everything in the universe, including the most distant galaxies or the highest deity in the highest heaven. Is that a position that you feel comfortable with? I
know Ray Hernandez very well. We worked closely together on Free, and he is right. There is an interrelationship among these experiences, and consciousness may be that foundational aspect to it. But he's not unique in that idea. It's not his. This has been expressed by numerous people before Ray Hernandez came up on the scene. I commend him for his efforts in facilitating the survey that we used in over 3,000 people for the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Research Foundation. But consciousness is primary in my mind. Mass, matter, energy, they're all derivatives of consciousness. And the hard problem of consciousness, which neuroscience can't explain, will always be hard because it won't be found in the brain. How do you explain what philosophers call qualia, the essence of a subjective experience, the awe-inspiring feelings that we have when we see something of magnificence? It's what Einstein said: all religions, sciences, and arts come from the same branch of a tree. They're all interrelated in a sense. And to me, consciousness is information exchange. And it's easy for me to say that because there's been an endless stream of papers written on consciousness generated by thousands of scholars across many disciplines over many decades, trying to better understand the nature of what consciousness really is and how your brain provides that sense of an individual self. What it feels like to be you, rather than just a level of wakefulness, which a neuroscientist will regard as consciousness, a level of being awake, coma or no coma, or variations thereof. Now, the subjective experience could forever be beyond the reach of neuroscience to explain consciousness. But again, to me, consciousness represents information exchange. It's the fabric of our universe, and it exists everywhere. And we see information exchange occurring at every level of our physical world. We see it at the microscopic subatomic level, the observer effect, where a wave acts as a wave until it observes and then it becomes a particle. There's information exchange occurring that's altering its behavior. We see this too in human to physical system information transference, ESP, psychokinesis, healing with intent. That's information exchange. That's consciousness. We see it macroscopically. The Global Consciousness Project, led by Robert John and Nelson Dunn, they proved that information exchange exists globally through the random number generator experiments. And we see it cosmologically too. Information exchange. In fact, you're seeing me right now because of the Big Bang approximately 14 billion years ago, because light energy just now from the Big Bang is reaching your visual system, allowing you to interpret what you see cognitively in terms of reality. So we see this interconnection at every level of existence. And yet we don't have a clear understanding, or a uniform definition, shall we say, of what consciousness is, because it's very discipline specific. You talk to philosophers, theologians, medical scientists, and you'll get different interpretations of what consciousness is. But it is foundational. Ray is right. Many of the thousands of people are right. It represents the basis for change in response to other facilitating events. And in my mind, it is extraordinary human experiences that give rise to the facilitation of altered states of consciousness and associated changes in levels of behavior and beliefs, largely positive, not always. In fact, there was a recent study I read last week. There was an analysis of over 1,000 articles over a 10-year period, and there were approximately 30 different definitions of consciousness within those articles. Now we're narrowing it down, but we obviously don't have a clear consensus of what it is.
Well, let's go to your definition of information exchange. I have trouble with that definition, Bob, because computers are exchanging information all the time, resulting in very real-world impacts. We see that especially today with artificial intelligence. Computers are creating beautiful works of art and so on. But I personally don't think computers are conscious. I've interviewed Federico Fagin, the fellow who was involved in inventing the microprocessor. And he says, at base, the computer is just a bunch of switches, on, off, or 0, 1. Each switch is simply on, off. There's no consciousness there, in his view. On the other hand, I think he's inclined to think that the whole universe is conscious. So there's a paradox. The whole universe can be conscious, but computers at this point in time are not. Although I know in computational psychology, people believe that the human brain works like a computer, and that if we process enough information, even our computers will become conscious, and some people even think they are already.
You're right, Jeff. And I debate that definition too of information exchange. But if you adopt the position of panpsychism, then all physical systems, human and non-human, have some level of consciousness. This table that I'm banging my hand on, I mean, it's semantic, but you can say there's a level of consciousness in this physical structure. Why? It's giving me information, because if I bang my head very hard against it, that desk is telling me not to do it again. Or maybe it's me convincing myself not to do it again. But it's a low level of information exchange. That's what the panpsychics would contend.
Mm-hmm. Would you consider yourself a panpsychist?
And in some ways, but I'm more of an idealist.
Yeah.
I see myself there, but there's overlap among all of them, between monism, dualism, panpsychism, idealism, you name it. There's many different types of interpretations of consciousness that's often based on religion, spirituality, belief systems, experience. But I tend to think that at some level everything is conscious, in the sense that we're receiving information from it. So, for my definition, you can make a case that everything is conscious because we're receiving information. If I look at a wall, I see it blue or white or yellow, and it'll evoke a reaction in me, a conscious reaction in me. That doesn't necessarily mean that is conscious, but it is giving me information. It's a low level of consciousness, but it's highly debatable. Obviously, nobody's going to have a clear answer for it. But in order to have a paradigm shift in science, to acknowledge what we're talking about, we need to adopt a clearer definition of just what consciousness really means among scholars, to unify different opinions across different fields of study, like philosophy, theology, medicine, etc. Are we talking about mental intuition or intention, self-awareness, free will, level of alertness, aspects of higher order cognitive functioning? It gets into a language diatribe, and we get caught up debating these issues when we don't have a clear consensus of the definitions involved in what we are talking about. There's no clear definition of what consciousness is. So if I give you an answer of what I think consciousness is, it's very easy to dispel it or dispute it because there's a lack of consensus, no agreement. And before we have that paradigm shift, which we sorely need, we do need to have, again, that formal, accepted, uniform opinion among all scholars across all disciplines of what truly consciousness represents.
I'll give you mine.
Please.
Which is, I would distinguish, along with other scholars like Brian Josephson, the Nobel laureate physicist, makes the same distinction. Stuart Hameroff, the consciousness researcher, I think would agree with it. Thomas Nagel, the philosopher of consciousness, would agree there's a distinction between mind and consciousness. I would regard information processing as a function of mind, and we see that computers are very good at information processing without consciousness. Nagel defines consciousness as that it has to be like something to be conscious. That is, in his famous essay, What is it like to be a bat? It's like something to be a bat. It's like something to be a person, but it may not be like anything to be a table, because a table may lack all consciousness. It may be like something to be the whole universe. So it's to me, that's a working definition, and I know Hameroff in his theoretical work would suggest that consciousness takes place at the quantum level. Federico Fagin suggests the same. Outside of time and space completely. Information processing, however, could be done at the electromagnetic level, definitely in time and space and physical.
You're making very good points, Jeff. I do regard the brain as a quantum processor. Hameroff, of course, and Penrose contend that the microtubules, or the cytoskeleton of neurons in the brain, represent the origin of conscious events. When these neurons fire, it gives rise, in other words, to a conscious moment that's shared throughout the brain. But Hameroff goes beyond that and contends that we actually have a quantum holographic theory of consciousness, where consciousness leaves the deceased body and persists Edgar Mitchell believed the same thing under the same heading of that theory. Fagin, I think, will contend that might be the case as well. We're talking about quantum process, non-locality, and the question is, does that mean there is an afterlife? Does that mean we are interacting with other beings, the deceased, deities? What essentially does that mean when we say mind versus consciousness? And again, we're getting caught up, I think, a little bit in semantics. You talk about mind to a neuroscientist, and I remember my professor saying, you stay away from that structure in the low brain. It's called the brain stem. You put too much pressure on that and you're going to alter consciousness, and the person could die, lose consciousness. In a sense, we're talking about brain and mind, but they don't go much further than that. They don't talk about quantum processes. Yet now there's a recent paper that's showing that quantum processes can and does exist in warm, wet environments, like a 3.5 pound mass of protein and fat sitting between your ears. It gives rise to the fact that brain can be a quantum processor. And what that implies can mean anything.
Well, it certainly seems from everything I know and you know that we're at the very beginning of a new approach in science to looking at consciousness at all, because for decades it was considered a taboo topic. That even although the very word psychology means the study of the soul, it was considered forbidden to think of it that way.
Excuse me? It's the what of the soul?
The study of the soul, the psyche.
What does that mean? Is that where we have dissolution? The meaning of I, who I am, when we say our consciousness is being altered by an external event that's awe-inspiring. Is it my mind that is changing? It is my consciousness that is changing. It is my brain that is changing, that's giving rise to these sensations and new talents and changes in behavior and beliefs. What is causing that? Is that brain-based? Is it consciousness-based? What gives rise to those dramatic shifts in behavior that accompany these extraordinary human experiences that come in diverse ways? We could talk about the quantum hologram theory of consciousness, and I think Fagin ascribes to that, and I'm not certain. But Dr. Edgar Mitchell does, and Hammeroff does, and basically we're talking about a self-organizing, interconnected, holistic system that retains information of each experience that's stored in a holographic form. Now, that's mathematically derived. The question is, can we extrapolate mathematical concepts into reality? You can prove the quantum hologram theory of consciousness on a piece of paper, but what does that mean functional-wise? What's the functionality of it? How does that impact our psychospiritual behavior? But human consciousness, according to that theory, is not confined to the brain. It could be a part of a larger interconnected, I think is the word, system that's capable of transferring information across time. And people even explain past life experiences based on quantum processes, which, according to, again, Hammeroff, continue on end. And it's hard to comprehend it. It's hard to just talk about it because it is so nebulous, and that's why I'm comfortable and not comfortable discussing consciousness. even in my writings about it, I have great hesitancy because there are so many conflicting opinions from all the different disciplines that regard consciousness differently.
Well, it seems as if words and symbols can only take us so far. They're essential. We can't live without them. But ultimately, I think the point of most spiritual traditions, mystical traditions, meditative traditions is that we can have an experience of pure consciousness, and ultimately it's inevitable. Those who try to describe it will always fall short.
It's one I had, Jeff. You just reminded me of a shared death experience I had, but it gets to your point. One morning I awoke in having a lucid dream where I felt like I was dying. It was death. I couldn't breathe. While that was happening, I received information that my colleague in the lab where I worked had died. I didn't think much of that, other than it was such an extraordinary dream that's what got my attention as I was driving to work that morning. Not that she had died, the information I had received that she had died. When I opened the door to my laboratory, I noticed the obvious distress on my colleagues' faces, and I knew right then and there that my dear friend and colleague Anne passed away. And I found out that she passed away at the same time that I had that shared death or empathic death experience. So how do you put that? How do you put that in words? It's ineffable. But I received information. It wasn't concrete. It wasn't written. It wasn't on the screen of a TV or a computer. It was an ineffable exchange of information that was given to me. I wouldn't say it's a meaningful coincidence at all, because why would I know she died when she did, when I never have had an experience like that before? The uniqueness of the synchronicity, in a sense, of the timing and the meaning of the event was more than convincing that there is some aspect of life, call it consciousness or whatever, that obviously is poorly understood, but must be understood. And that's what motivated me to write my next book after my UFO book, Life After Death, an Analysis of the Evidence. And then after my Kundalini, I wrote Unseen Forces, the integration of science, reality, and you, which we talked about on our last show. And for the past 2 years, I've been spending time while nursing a painful back, writing this book. And I appreciate you writing the foreword to the book, The Consciousness Connection: Extraordinary Human Experiences and the Nature of Reality. I don't contend to have an answer, the answer. I can't be that egoic like many of my colleagues who I communicate with are, who regard consciousness as an epiphenomenon of the brain. And as the brain dissipates, well, it's dust to dust and ashes to ashes. So does consciousness. So is it a form of information exchange? Is it a form of information technology? Are we talking about quantum entanglement governed by an intention, that form of information technology? How do we come to terms with people who claim to have downloaded experiences of telepathic information being expressed to them from other entities, and it's not coming from them? It reminds me of mediumship. I know I'm jumping all over the place, but these thoughts come in my head here. Mediumship, which is probably the best evidence we have to support the survival hypothesis, and is real. Mediumship is real, despite many of those who put people on for a living. There are many true mediums that can actually communicate with the deceased. there was a recent study done by Andrew Newberg. He does work in neo-theology. He measured the frontal lobe in mediums while they were singing and while they were doing their mediumship, while there were drop-in cases or drop-ins, other entities entering the body, taking it over, and expressing communication through the body, supposedly. What Newberg found was that the frontal lobe, which controls for self-regulation, self-control, higher order cognitive functioning, actually decreased. Not in response to them singing or listening, I should say, to people singing as a control group, but it occurred, the decrease in the frontal lobe decreased when they had the drop-in communication, leading him to conclude that these drop-ins represent a distinct neurologic brain state, indicating to this scientist that people are indeed being taken over by another entity. It is not them, in other words, during the drop-in when that communication occurs.
Well, to the extent we can find physiological correlates of valid psychic experiences, it would seem that we might have a tool to distinguish between pure fantasy, which is the skeptical interpretation, and authentic experiences.
And Jeffrey Kripal talks about that, the science of the imagination, and what is reality. Can we consider, in other words, our imagination, which to us may be real? Thus, is it real? Is it a valid experience? If I believe it in terms of my imagination, maybe it is valid. That's something that we have to clarify. The distinction between imagination and non-imagination, and what the brain is doing between the two. We see less connectivity when people are engaged in imagination. The default mode network of the brain is just doing its thing at rest, almost like a computer while it's sleeping. But when we engage in any kind of activity, we get out of the default mode network, and we become much more conscious and much more capable, certainly, of governing our intention through quantum entanglement and then some. So we don't have the clear, distinct definition between imagination and non-imagination, and what it represents.
I know the philosopher Henri Corbin likes to distinguish between imagination on the one hand, like Peter Pan or Mickey Mouse, and the imaginal on the other hand, which is where Corbin personally said he's received profound spiritual teachings from deceased Sufi masters from the 12th century.
People say that when they have drop-ins, true mediums will contend that they're receiving information from other entities, and it comes into their mind as a distinctly different thought to them. They clearly distinguish the information they're receiving from a discarnate entity or otherwise versus their normal line of thought. And then they will take the dictation and write down everything. And according to the Windbridge Institute, the mediums that are being studied there generally come up with an accuracy of up to 80%. I regard mediumship much more strongly than I have in the past after I did my research in that area. There have been many meta-analyses of mediumships that clearly demonstrate the accuracy of information in those who are trustworthy, in those who are trained, and people can be trained to become mediums, so to improve their skill. But you tweak also certain areas of the brain. Getting back to our discussion just prior, there could be tumors in the parietal lobe of the brain, and sometimes these tumors cause people to become more spiritual or less spiritual. And we see, in a few studies at least, that removing a tumor can change one's spirituality from belief to non-belief. Now, I don't know what that means, but people studying that or doing the surgery will then say, this area of the brain represents spirituality because I made some modifications to it. And we see an associated change in belief systems, in spirituality, among other things. So, can we reduce consciousness and spirituality to neuroscience? No. We don't have a neurological representation of what we experience. We don't have something in the brain that says, I'm blue, this is a rainbow, this is waterfalls. You can't find that in the brain, nor can you find the reaction of the essence of emotion associated with these extraordinary scenes or inspiring events, let alone what we're talking about in paranormal studies. We can't ascribe an anatomical structure to something like this.
Well, at the end of the day, it does seem to me that neuroscience or science is making some progress. You've reported a number of studies that view mediums very positively. I know when William James 100 years ago began reporting, 120 or 130 years ago now, began reporting his studies with the medium Lenora Piper and published it in the pages of Science. He was viciously attacked, and it seemed at that point to James himself, he said, any scientist who writes favorably about a medium is automatically categorized as a crank. So I would say that at least we've made a little progress in that domain.
Your point being that
over the last 150 years or so, you can see that progress is slowly being made, and I suppose based on the rate at which we've seen that progress, we can project out and say another 200 or 300 years, and maybe we will begin to have a society that has a relatively consensus view about the mysteries of consciousness.
Well said. And I'm a very impatient person, which motivated me to write the books that I mentioned, especially on the heels of these experiences, which inherently are motivational. I would never have written them unless I had the experience. I wouldn't be talking to you now unless I had these experiences. This is how it changed me. How it changed me is something that I can explain from a psycho-spiritual perspective, emotional perspective, but I have no doubt that my behavior has been significantly modified, becoming much more of a truth seeker, talking about spirituality and consciousness in ways that I never would have in the past. So, people who have these experiences, in fact, there was a survey done of something like 1,600 Americans, a Gallup poll, and you can extrapolate to 80 million Americans based on the outcomes of the survey, which indicated that approximately 60% of people identify with the statement that their life has been severely changed as a result of a spiritual experience.
I consider myself in that category, and many of our viewers will understand themselves to be in it as well.
It's more common than you think, and it's generally underreported because of the stigma associated with it. But, you ask a group of people in a room, how many of you have had an unexplained experience, and you're going to see a show of hands. That's not uncommon. That's if they're being truthful and not concerned about how they're going to be interpreted.
Well, Bob Davis, this has been an enlightening conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, everything from mediumship to healing to near-death experiences to UFOs and Kundalini, and throughout there's the common thread of consciousness and, of course, the mystery of consciousness as well. You've been a great tour guide and certainly very honest and open about your own experiences. It's been a joy to be with you, Bob. Thank you so much.
That's very kind of you to say, Jeff. And again, thank you for writing the foreword to my book and your support in general. I encourage people to go to Gaia.com and look at our documentary, The Consciousness Connection Foundations, and my book, The Conscious Connection, which also parallels the documentary, trying to bring it to life a little bit. But Jeff, thank you so much for your time and the invitation to be with you. It's a pleasure.
It's been a great pleasure for me. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org